The fluorescent lights in the Brooklyn diner buzzed like a warning no one heard. On one side of a cracked vinyl booth sat Kendra Hutchinson, fighting to keep her composure after 20 years of private hell. On the other, her husband, Jabari Hutchinson, a man who believed his political power made him untouchable. He smiled for the cameras, he promised dignity to the city, and he charmed everyone who crossed his path. And then, in a flash of rage he couldn't contain, he did the unthinkable. He struck his wife hard across the face in the middle of the nearly empty diner, the crack echoing like a gunshot through the silence. But Jabari made one fatal mistake. He never bothered to look 3 booths behind him. He never realized that the 14-year-old kid with the phone in his hands was recording every single second. The teenager who recognized the mayoral candidate from posters all over his neighborhood. The brownstone in Brooklyn Heights wasn't a home. It was a stage. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the Manhattan skyline like a backdrop Jabari Hutchinson had personally arranged. The furniture was all carefully curated elegance, chosen by an interior designer whose invoice Kendra had never been allowed to see. Nothing in the 4,500-square-foot space felt warm, and nothing truly belonged to Kendra. For 20 years, Kendra Hutchinson had lived as a beautiful prop in someone else's political ambition. When she first met Jabari, he was magnetic. He was a young attorney with fire in his eyes and justice on his tongue. He was passionate, principled, and utterly compelling. He had pursued her with an intensity that made her feel seen. He'd promised her they would change the world together, that she would be his partner in every sense of the word. But her mother, a woman who had survived her own difficult marriage, had sensed something darker beneath the charm. "He doesn't want a partner, baby," her mother had warned, voice trembling with concern. "He wants an accessory. A man like that doesn't share power. He performs it. And he'll expect you to perform right alongside him." Kendra, then 28 and convinced she had found her soulmate, had dismissed the warning as cynicism from another generation. That choice had cost her more than she could have imagined. Her mother had been right about everything. The distance that grew between them became its own quiet tragedy, a relationship strained by unspoken "I told you so's." At first, Jabari's love had been intoxicating in its attention. Flowers delivered to her office every week. Surprise weekend getaways to the Hamptons. Introductions to powerful people who could open doors for her career. But the attention was a cage. Soon the career opportunities dried up because he needed her available for campaign events. Then her opinions became too controversial for a political wife, so he'd gently correct her in public until she stopped sharing them. Her friends were drama and distractions, so he'd schedule conflicts until the invitations stopped coming. Her independence was selfishness, so he'd frame every boundary she tried to set as a betrayal of their shared vision. And when the quiet storms in his eyes turned to thunder, when his jaw tightened and his voice dropped to that dangerous register, she learned to read the weather and take cover. The apologies always came, but only when there were cameras, only when there were donors to impress, only when his image demanded it. Behind closed doors, there was no remorse. Only control. Only the relentless message that she existed to serve his ambition. For 20 years, Kendra had been the perfect political wife. Smiling, supporting, and silent. And then on a late Thursday night, after one more exhausting performance at a women's empowerment event, the bitter irony wasn't lost on her. Something inside her finally cracked. She stopped performing. She stopped pretending. She told him the truth. And Jabari, the man who promised to restore dignity to New York City, showed the world exactly who he'd always been. By noon the next day, a 12-second video had been viewed 3 million times. And the city that was ready to crown him their leader finally saw the monster that Kendra had lived with for 2 decades. The man who struck his wife in a diner. The man whose private cruelty could no longer hide behind public charm. The man whose entire carefully constructed empire was about to crumble, all because a 14-year-old kid named Jake hit record. Jabari Hutchinson had always understood the power of a well-told story. His own began in a modest apartment in Bed-Stuy, the son of a postal worker and a public school teacher who'd scraped together every dollar to send him to Columbia Law. He graduated summa cum laude, clerked for a federal judge, and built a reputation as the attorney who took on police brutality cases no one else would touch. By 35, he'd argued before the Second Circuit. By 40, he was being courted by both political parties. And by 45, his name was synonymous with integrity. The narrative was perfect because most of it was true. What the newspapers didn't print, what the documentary crew never captured, was what happened when the cameras turned off and the doors closed behind him. Kendra had learned the difference early. In public, Jabari's hand rested gently on the small of her back, a gesture of partnership the photographers loved. In private, that same hand gripped her arm hard enough to leave marks she'd cover with long sleeves at the next fundraiser. In public, he introduced her as my brilliant wife, my partner in all things. In private, he'd review her conversations from the evening like a prosecutor cross-examining a hostile witness, dissecting every word she'd said, correcting every opinion she'd offered, reminding her that she represented him now and everything she did reflected on his future. The future. It was always about the future. His future. The congressional seat he'd held for 12 years was just the foundation. The mayoral race was the inevitable next step. After that, governor. Maybe more. Kendra had stopped asking where she fit into these grand plans. She already knew the answer. She was the set decoration. The proof of his humanity. The attractive, accomplished woman who chose him, which meant he must be worth choosing. She'd been accomplished once. A degree in social work from NYU. 3 years at a nonprofit advocating for foster youth before Jabari suggested she could do more good supporting his work. She'd been writing a policy proposal on juvenile justice reform when he gently closed her laptop one evening and reminded her that the campaign needed her attention more than another white paper no one would read. That was 14 years ago. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked her opinion on policy. They asked about her dress, her shoes, whether she'd always known Jabari was destined for greatness. The word dignity appeared in every single one of Jabari's campaign speeches. He spoke about restoring dignity to working families, to overlooked communities, to a city that had lost its way. His voice would swell with righteous conviction when he promised that every New Yorker deserved to be treated with respect, to be seen, to be heard. The crowds ate it up. The editorials praised his moral clarity. The endorsements rolled in from unions, advocacy groups, civic leaders who believed he meant every word. Kendra would stand beside him on those stages, smiling until her face ached, and marvel at the performance. This man who spoke so passionately about dignity had spent 2 decades systematically stripping hers away. This man who promised to give voice to the voiceless had spent years ensuring his own wife had learned when to speak and, more importantly, when to stay silent. The polls showed him leading by double digits. The victory party was already being planned. New York City was ready to elect Jabari Hutchinson as their next mayor, the man who would restore dignity to every corner of the 5 boroughs. None of them knew that dignity had never lived in his home. That behind the brownstone's elegant facade, Kendra had become an expert in reading storms, in calculating risk, in surviving the man the city was about to crown. She'd become fluent in the language of his anger, the tightening jaw, the cold silence, the sudden eruptions that left her shaking and him apologizing only when his image required it. 20 years. 2 decades of building the lie. Of perfecting the performance. Of maintaining the facade that was about to shatter in a Brooklyn diner because Jabari Hutchinson forgot, for just 12 seconds, that his private self and his public self could no longer remain separate. While the city wanted dignity, Kendra just wanted to survive. Kendra had become a meteorologist of moods. She could predict Jabari's weather patterns with the accuracy of someone whose survival depended on it. The tightening around his eyes when a reporter asked an unexpected question. The way his smile would freeze for half a second when she spoke without waiting for his cue. the particular quality of silence in the car ride home that told her whether she had 15 minutes or 15 seconds before the storm broke. She'd learned this language the way children of alcoholics learn to read footsteps on stairs, not by choice, but by necessity. It started with small corrections. "That's not quite what I meant, sweetheart. Let me clarify what Kendra was trying to say. My wife sometimes forgets that nuance matters in these discussions." Each correction delivered with a smile, with a gentle touch, with the implicit message that he was protecting her from her own inadequacy. The people around them would nod sympathetically, grateful that Kendra had such a patient husband to guide her through the complexities of political discourse. She'd believed it herself, at first. Maybe she wasn't articulate enough for this world. Maybe her opinions were too simplistic for rooms full of lawyers and strategists and people who'd spent their entire lives in politics. Maybe she should be grateful that Jabari cared enough to help her understand where she'd gone wrong. But corrections in public meant reckonings in private. The car door would close and his hand would find her thigh, fingers pressing just hard enough to hurt without leaving evidence. "What were you thinking?" It wasn't a question, but an accusation. "Do you have any idea how that made me look?" As if her existence was measured solely by its reflection on him. She'd learned to apologize, to promise she'd do better, to accept his version of reality over her own lived experience because resistance only made everything worse. He never hit her, not then, not in those early years. He didn't need to. He had other tools. The silent treatment that could last for days. The withdrawal of affection that left her desperate to earn her way back into his good graces. The subtle reminders of everything she'd be without him. The security he provides and the status. Her friends noticed first, the way these things always happen gradually and then all at once. Blue, her college roommate, had tried for 3 years to maintain their weekly coffee dates. But there was always a campaign event Jabari needed Kendra to attend, always a donor dinner that took precedence, always a reason why this week wouldn't work. When Blue finally stopped reaching out, Kendra told herself it was natural. People drifted apart. Lives moved in different directions. It wasn't abandonment. It was evolution. Except it wasn't. It was isolation dressed up as importance. Jabari had a gift for making exclusion feel like elevation. "You're beyond those friendships now," he'd say. "You're operating at a different level. They wouldn't understand the pressures we're under." The message was clear. Her old life was small, and he'd made her bigger. To go back would be regression. Ingratitude. Betrayal. Her mother stopped calling after a particularly brutal Christmas dinner where Jabari had spent 3 hours subtly correcting everything Kendra said, reframing every childhood memory she shared, steering every conversation back to his accomplishments. Kendra had watched her mother's face shift from concern to resignation to something that looked like grief. The phone calls became texts. The texts became birthday cards. The birthday cards became silence. Kendra told herself her mother didn't understand modern marriage, didn't understand partnership, didn't understand what it meant to be married to someone whose work mattered, whose vision could change lives, whose ambition required sacrifice. If Kendra had to sacrifice her old self to become the woman Jabari needed, wasn't that what love demanded? But late at night, when Jabari was traveling for campaign stops or working late at headquarters, Kendra would lie awake and catalog the pieces of herself that had disappeared. The social work degree she'd earned with honors, now just a line on a biography no one read. The policy interests that had once consumed her, now dismissed as not her lane. The opinions she'd held, the convictions she believed in, the version of herself who'd once been certain about things, all of it smoothed away like inconvenient edges on a sculpture being refined into something more acceptable. She'd learned to make herself smaller, to take up less space in conversations, to smile instead of speak, to nod instead of challenge, to exist as an extension of him rather than as a separate person with separate thoughts and separate rights to those thoughts. The worst part wasn't the anger. Anger she could have left. Anger would have given her permission to go. The worst part was that he genuinely seemed to believe he was helping her, improving her, making her worthy of the life he'd provided. Every criticism was framed as investment. Every control was positioned as care. Every restriction was presented as protection from a world that would hurt her far worse than he ever could. 3 months ago, something had shifted. She challenged him about a policy position, gently and privately, in their own kitchen, suggesting his stance on affordable housing didn't match the reality she'd seen in the nonprofit sector. He'd gone quiet in a way she'd never experienced before. Not the familiar cold silence. Something darker. More absolute. Then his hand had found her throat. Not squeezing. Just resting there. A promise more than a threat. "I need you to understand something," he'd said, voice terrifyingly calm. "Everything I've built for us. Every sacrifice I've made has been for this family. And I will not let you undermine that because you've decided you suddenly understand politics better than I do." His hand had stayed there for 5 seconds. Maybe 10. Long enough for her to understand that the lines she believed existed, lines he'd never cross, boundaries he'd never violate, were illusions she created to make the situation survivable. She never reported it. Never told anyone. Never even acknowledged it to herself beyond the nightmares that woke her gasping, hand at her own throat, the phantom pressure still somehow there. She'd learned to read the storms. But she'd never learned how to escape them. Until a Thursday night in a Brooklyn diner, when the storm finally broke in public and a 14-year-old kid with a phone captured the 12 seconds that would set her free. Before that moment, though, there was one more performance to endure. One more day of smiling and pretending and being the perfect political wife for a man who'd spent 20 years teaching her that she existed only to serve his ambition. The campaign trail was calling. And Kendra Hutchinson had learned long ago that when Jabari called, there was only one acceptable answer. The polls had Jabari up by 14 points. 16 in some districts. The kind of numbers that made political consultants giddy and opponents desperate. Campaign headquarters hummed with the electric confidence of a team that could already taste victory. Volunteers made calls with religious fervor. Donors opened their wallets wider. The editorial boards of 3 major newspapers had endorsed him in the same week. Jabari Hutchinson wasn't just running for mayor. He was inevitable. Which meant Kendra's presence was required everywhere. The women's luncheon in Midtown, where she smiled through speeches about empowerment while having no power over her own schedule. The community center in the Bronx, where she nodded along as Jabari promised to protect vulnerable families, knowing she couldn't protect herself. The donor dinner in Tribeca, where she wore the dress he'd chosen, the jewelry he'd selected, the smile he'd perfected on her face over 20 years of practice. Thursday had been particularly brutal. A morning photo op at a domestic violence shelter, the irony so thick Kendra nearly laughed, where she'd stood beside her husband as he promised that every woman deserved to feel safe in her own home. The director of the shelter had gripped Kendra's hand a moment too long, eyes searching her face as if she could see the bruises that weren't visible. Kendra had pulled away and smiled harder. Then a women's empowerment event in Brooklyn, where a 17-year-old girl had asked Kendra what advice she had for young women finding their voice. Kendra had frozen, the prepared answer dissolving on her tongue, replaced by a truth she couldn't speak. Learn to recognize when someone is taking your voice before you've even realized it's gone. Instead, she'd said something about education and persistence and believing in yourself. The words tasted like ash. Jabari had noticed her hesitation. She'd seen it in the tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture. The storm was building. She could feel it gathering pressure throughout the afternoon, through the handshaking and the photo opportunities and the carefully scripted interactions with voters who believed they were meeting the real Jabari Hutchinson. By evening, Kendra was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. She was tired of performing. Tired of smiling. Tired of being a prop in someone else's narrative about dignity and justice and protection. The bitter irony of it all had worn through her defenses. 20 years of this. 20 years of standing beside a man who promised the world everything he denied her. "We should grab dinner," Jabari had said as they left the final event, his hand on her back in that practiced gesture of affection. "Somewhere quiet. You've been off today. We need to talk." Those 4 words, "we need to talk," never meant conversation. They meant correction, recalibration, reminding her of her role. Kendra had nodded, climbed into the car, and watched Brooklyn blur past the window. She was so tired of being afraid, so tired of being small, so tired of pretending. She didn't know yet that this particular storm would be different, that it would break in public instead of private, that 3 booths away, a 14-year-old kid named Jake would be paying attention when everyone else had learned to look away. The diner was nearly empty. Jabari had chosen it deliberately, far enough from their usual circles that no one would recognize them, late enough that the dinner crowd had dispersed. Just a few stragglers, an elderly couple nursing coffee in the corner, a woman working on a laptop near the window, a kid in a booth doing homework with his phone propped against the napkin dispenser. Perfect privacy for the conversation he'd been waiting to have all day. They sat across from each other in a cracked vinyl booth, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped behind plastic. Kendra ordered coffee she wouldn't drink. Jabari ordered nothing. He didn't need anything. He was already full of the day's successes, full of his own inevitability, full of the corrections he'd been storing up since her hesitation at the empowerment event. "You embarrassed me today," he said. Not loud. He never needed volume. His voice had that quality of cold precision that made every word land like a verdict. "That girl asked you a simple question, and you froze like you'd forgotten how to speak." Kendra stared at the coffee cup. Dark liquid reflecting the fluorescent lights above. "I answered her. Eventually. After making me look like I'd married someone incapable of basic communication." He leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand what's at stake here? We're 2 weeks from the election. 2 weeks from everything we've worked for. And you're having some kind of existential crisis in front of donors and voters and people who are deciding whether I'm fit to lead this city." "Everything you've worked for," Kendra said quietly. The words slipped out before she could stop them. "Not we. You." The air shifted. She felt it immediately, that sudden drop in temperature that preceded every storm she'd weathered for 20 years. But something was different this time. She was different. Too tired to care about the consequences. Too empty to perform anymore. "Excuse me." Jabari's voice dropped even lower. "Dangerous territory. I stood in a domestic violence shelter today and listened to you promise women they deserve to feel safe." Kendra looked up, met his eyes for the first time since they'd sat down. "I stood at a women's empowerment event and told a 17-year-old girl to find her voice. Do you have any idea what that felt like? Any idea at all?" Then came the words from Jabari, "Watch yourself." Not a suggestion. A command. But Kendra couldn't stop. 20 years of swallowed words were rising up her throat like bile. "I've spent 2 decades being your accessory. Your proof of concept. The woman who chose you, so you must be worth choosing. I've smiled through your corrections and your criticisms and your complete erasure of who I used to be. I've let you isolate me from everyone who cared about me because you convinced me it was for us. For the vision. For the future that was always yours and never mine. You need to stop talking. Right now." Jabari's jaw was rigid, that tightness she knew so well. But they were in public. He couldn't. "I'm tired, Jabari. I'm so tired of pretending. Tired of being a prop in your campaign for dignity when you've spent 20 years stripping mine away piece by piece until there's nothing left." His hand moved so fast she didn't see it coming. The slap caught her across the cheek with enough force to snap her head sideways, the crack of flesh on flesh echoing through the diner like a gunshot. Time fractured. Kendra's hand flew to her face, tears springing instantly to her eyes, not from pain, though her cheek blazed hot, but from shock. From the final shattering of the illusion that there were still lines he wouldn't cross. Not here. Not in public. Not where anyone could see. But he had. He'd done it. The mask had finally slipped completely. Jabari seemed to realize it in the same instant. His eyes widened, not with remorse but with calculation. With the immediate assessment of damage control. He glanced around the diner, the elderly couple staring in frozen horror, the woman at the window with her hand over her mouth, the kid in the booth. The kid. Maybe 14, 15 years old. Staring at them with his phone in his hands, positioned just so against the napkin dispenser. The angle was perfect. Had been perfect the whole time. But Jabari's attention didn't linger. He was already pivoting back to Kendra, his voice shifting into something that almost sounded like concern. The performance clicking back into place even as his wife sat across from him with her cheek flaming red and her world collapsing. "Kendra," he started. "Don't." She stood up, legs shaking, voice breaking. "Don't you dare." She grabbed her purse and walked out of the diner, past the staring witnesses, past the kid with the phone, past the future that was already unraveling behind her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Behind her, Jabari sat frozen in the booth, his mind racing through scenarios and strategies and ways to contain what had just happened. He'd built his entire career on control, on image management, on the careful construction of narrative. He didn't know yet that this was one story he wouldn't be able to rewrite. That 3 booths away, a kid named Jake had captured 12 seconds that would dismantle 20 years of lies. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The coffee grew cold. And somewhere in the Brooklyn night, the video was already beginning its journey toward millions of screens, carrying with it the truth Kendra had lived with for 2 decades. The man who promised to restore dignity to New York City had just shown the world exactly what he was. Jake had recognized Jabari Hutchinson the moment he walked in. Hard not to, the man's face was plastered on every other street corner in Brooklyn. Restore dignity. Vote Hutchinson. Jake had even written a paper about him for his civics class, arguing that Hutchinson represented a new generation of political leadership. His teacher had given him an A- and written thoughtful analysis in red pen. Jake was supposed to be working on his history homework, an essay on the civil rights movement that was due tomorrow and that he'd barely started. But his phone had been propped against the napkin dispenser, recording a time-lapse of him working that he'd planned to post on his Instagram story. Proof he was actually studying instead of scrolling. His followers ate that kind of content up, the productive student aesthetic that made everyone feel like they had their lives together even when they absolutely didn't. He'd noticed the tension between the couple 3 booths away almost immediately. The way the woman held herself so carefully, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. The way the man leaned forward with that particular kind of aggressive intensity Jake recognized from watching his own father before his parents divorced. He'd turned up his phone's audio sensitivity without thinking about it, some instinct telling him to pay attention. When the slap happened, Jake's whole body went rigid. The sound of it, that sharp crack, made the elderly couple gasp and the woman by the window freeze mid-keystroke. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Jake looked down at his phone. The recording was still running. The angle was perfect. He'd captured everything. His first thought wasn't about justice or morality or doing the right thing. His first thought, if he was being completely honest with himself, was simpler and more immediate. This is going to go so viral. He'd been posting content for 3 years, dance videos, comedy sketches, commentary on current events. His best video had gotten 40,000 views. This was different. This was the kind of content that didn't just go viral in his small corner of the internet. This was the kind of thing that jumped platforms, that got picked up by news outlets, that changed conversations. Jabari Hutchinson, the man who wanted to be mayor, hitting his wife in a public diner. Jake's hands shook as he stopped the recording and watched it back. 12 seconds. The sound was clear. The violence was undeniable. The man's face was perfectly visible. This could ruin him. Would ruin him. One video. One post. One moment of witnessing translated into evidence that millions of people could see. Jake thought about his civics paper. About the arguments he'd made in favor of Hutchinson's leadership. About the teacher's comments about thoughtful analysis. About how wrong he'd been. He thought about the woman who'd walked out with her hand pressed to her face, tears streaming. About how many times this might have happened before in private, where there was no one to record it. No one to bear witness. No one to care. His generation understood something older people didn't always get. Documentation is power. And visibility is accountability. The algorithm could be a tool for justice if you knew how to use it. Jake opened TikTok first. That's where things spread fastest. Then Instagram. Then Twitter. He typed the same caption across all 3 platforms. This is Jabari Hutchinson. He wants to be your mayor. This is who he really is. Hashtag Jabari Hutchinson, hashtag NYC, hashtag mayor, hashtag exposed. His thumb hovered over post for maybe 5 seconds. Then he pressed it. The video uploaded in seconds, appearing simultaneously across 3 platforms, already beginning its journey through the algorithmic machinery that would decide its fate. Jake watched the view count on TikTok tick up almost immediately. 10 views. 50. 100. By the time he packed up his homework and left the diner 20 minutes later, the video had been viewed 15,000 times. By the time he got home, it was trending. Jabari arrived at campaign headquarters at 8:30 Friday morning, coffee in hand, ready to review the weekend's final push before the election. 2 weeks. 14 days until he became mayor of the greatest city in the world. His assistant had texted him the overnight polling numbers, up another point. Momentum was everything, and they had it. He'd slept poorly, admittedly. The incident at the diner kept replaying in his mind, but he'd already constructed the narrative around it. A private marital dispute. Stress from the campaign. Kendra had always been fragile, prone to dramatics. If she said anything, which she wouldn't, she never did, he had responses prepared. He always did. The office felt wrong the moment he stepped off the elevator. Too quiet. Nobody looked at him. His communications director, Dante, was staring at his phone with the expression of someone witnessing a car accident. 2 interns huddled by the coffee station, whispering urgently. Celine from fundraising had tears streaming down her face. "What's going on?" Jabari asked, his voice carrying that natural authority that usually straightened spines and focused attention. Nobody answered. They just stared. Dante finally looked up, his face ashen. "Jabari, we need to talk. In your office. Right now." Through the glass walls of the main floor, Jabari could see volunteers at phone banks, except they weren't making calls. They were scrolling. Staring at screens. One young woman had her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. "Dante, what?" he asked, confused. Only to be cut short. "Your office. Now." Jabari's stomach dropped. He set down his coffee and walked through the bullpen, feeling every eye track his movement. The whispers started before he'd even reached his door. When he glanced at the nearest volunteer's computer screen, he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood go cold. A diner. Red vinyl booths. A frozen frame of his own face, mid-motion, hand raised. Inside his office, Dante closed the door and turned his laptop around. It posted last night around 9 p.m. On TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. It's been shared, he checked his phone, over 300,000 times. The hashtag #NotMyMayor is trending #2 nationally. #1 in New York. On the screen, a video looped. 12 seconds. Crystal clear audio and video. Kendra's voice, tired and breaking, "I'm so tired of pretending." His own voice, cold and commanding, "You need to stop talking. Right now." Her words tumbling out about being a prop, about dignity, about... Then the slap. The sound of it was somehow worse on video. Sharp, violent, and unmistakable. How many views? Jabari's voice didn't sound like his own. 4.2 million on TikTok alone. Another 2 million on Twitter. Instagram's at 1.8 and climbing. Marcus's hands were shaking. The Times cold. The Post. CNN. Every major outlet. They're all running with it. Mayoral candidate caught on video striking wife. Hutchinson's campaign of dignity crumbles after viral video. The networks want statements. Your opponents are calling for you to drop out. 3 endorsements have been withdrawn in the last hour. Jabari sank into his chair, eyes fixed on the screen as the video looped again. And again. And again. Each time, that frozen moment of his hand connecting with Kendra's face. The sound. Her shock. The witnesses staring. Who recorded this? A kid. 14 years old. He was in the diner doing homework. Dante pulled up a screenshot of Jake's TikTok profile. 500,000 new followers since last night. He's being called a hero. The kid who exposed Jabari Hutchinson. Through the glass walls, Jabari could see his staffers watching him. Some looked angry. Some looked betrayed. Some just looked sad, like they believed in something that turned out to be a lie. His phone started buzzing. And buzzing. And buzzing. Texts. Calls. Notifications flooding in so fast the screen couldn't keep up. His political mentor. His major donors. His coalition partners. Everyone who'd tied their name to his, now scrambling to untie the knots. On Dante's laptop, the view count ticked higher. 4.3 million. 4.4 million. It's not slowing down, Dante said quietly. If anything, it's accelerating. Morning shows are picking it up. It'll be the lead story on every evening news broadcast. By tonight, everyone in America will have seen this. Jabari watched himself slap his wife for the 15th time in 3 minutes. Each loop felt like a death. The death of his campaign. His reputation. His carefully constructed image of the man who would restore dignity to a city that was now watching him destroy it in 12 viral seconds. Sir. Dante's voice seemed to come from very far away. We need a response. We need to decide, do we deny, do we apologize, do we get out? Sir. Get out. Jabari's voice cracked. All of you. Just, I need a minute. I need to think. Dante left, closing the door behind him. Through the glass, Jabari watched his campaign staff begin to scatter, making calls, sending emails, desperately trying to control something that was already far beyond control. On the laptop screen, the video looped again. 4.6 million views. 12 seconds that erased 20 years. Outside his office, phones rang. People shouted. The machine he'd built to carry him to power was tearing itself apart in real time, and all Jabari could do was watch his own face on a screen, frozen in the moment when he'd forgotten the most important rule of politics, that everyone is always watching. Even when you think they're not. Especially then. The protesters arrived by 10 a.m. Jabari could hear them from his office, 12 floors up. Chanting. Drums. Air horns. Not our mayor. Not our mayor. The sound filtered through the sealed windows like a verdict he couldn't appeal. Dante returned with his crisis management team. People Jabari had paid obscene amounts of money to handle exactly this kind of situation. Except there had never been a situation quite like this. They sat around his desk with their tablets and their polling data and their focus group responses, and every single option they presented sounded like surrender. "We issue a statement taking full responsibility," said Teresa, his head of communications. "Announce you're entering treatment for anger management. Cancel all campaign events. Give Kendra space to." No. Jabari's voice was flat. "That's admitting guilt. That's letting them win." "Sir, with respect, the video is the admission. 4.9 million people have watched you hit your wife. There's no spin for this. No angle. No way to reframe." "There's always a way." But even as he said it, Jabari knew it was a lie. For the first time in 20 years, the machinery of narrative control had failed him. Or rather, he destroyed it himself in 12 seconds of rage he couldn't take back. His phone buzzed again. Another donor, this time his largest one, asking to be removed from all campaign literature. The email was formal, distant. The kind of language you use when you're legally protecting yourself from association with something toxic. If you're watching this and you feel the same rage at what Jabari did, if you believe that abusers hiding behind power and respectability need to be exposed, hit that like button. And share this story. Let people know that abuse doesn't care about status or political promises or carefully crafted images. And if you want to see more stories that give voice to survivors and hold powerful people accountable, subscribe to this channel. Because every subscription, every share, every voice that says, "This is not acceptable," makes it harder for people like Jabari to hide. Together, we can take a stand against abuse, one story at a time. By noon, his campaign manager had resigned. By 1 p.m., 3 more staffers had followed. The office that had hummed with confident energy just 24 hours ago now felt like a morgue. People packed their belongings in silence, avoiding eye contact, whispering about resumes and job prospects and how they'd explain this on future interviews. Jabari sat in his office and watched the view counter climb. 6 million. 7 million. The comments were brutal. Thousands of people dissecting his character, his marriage, his entire career. People who'd never met him, never heard of him before yesterday, now absolutely certain they knew exactly who he was. The worst part was that they weren't wrong. His lawyer called. Criminal charges were likely, assault in the 3rd degree at minimum. With the video as evidence and multiple witnesses, a trial would be brief and devastating. His opponent had called a press conference to demand his immediate withdrawal from the race. The Democratic Party chair had issued a statement, deeply concerned about the serious allegations. Political speak for, "You're done." Jabari pulled up his own campaign website. His face smiling from every banner. "Restore dignity." The slogan that had tested so well, that had resonated with voters, that had carried him this far. Now it read like mockery. Like the punchline to a joke where he was both the comedian and the victim. He thought about calling Kendra. To apologize. To explain. But what was there to explain? The video showed everything. His private cruelty had become public record. The man he'd been behind closed doors was now the only version of him that mattered. At 3 p.m., Dante knocked quietly. "Sir, we need to make a decision. Every hour we don't respond, it gets worse. The story is metastasizing. They're digging into your marriage, your past relationships, allegations from staffers about your temper. It's becoming a reckoning." Jabari looked at him intently. Dante had worked for him for 6 years. He had believed in him, defended him, and now stood in his office with the posture of someone forced to clean up a crime scene. "What would you do?" Jabari asked. "If you were me?" Dante was quiet for a long moment. "I'd tell the truth. I'd admit what I did. I'd withdraw from the race. I'd get help. And I'd pray that Kendra finds the strength to do what she needs to do for herself. The truth. Such a simple concept. Such an impossible ask. Jabari turned back to the window. Below, the protesters had multiplied. The street was packed now, news cameras capturing it all. The implosion was complete. 20 years of construction demolished in less than 24 hours by a 14-year-old kid with a phone and a conscience. Draft a withdrawal statement, Jabari said finally. I'll review it in an hour. Dante nodded and left. Alone again, Jabari watched the video loop one more time. 8 million views now. His legacy reduced to 12 seconds. The man who promised dignity, immortalized in the moment he destroyed it. The city he'd wanted to lead had already rendered its verdict. And unlike elections, this one couldn't be won with money or charm or carefully constructed narratives. This one, he'd lost the moment he forgot who was watching. Kendra didn't watch the video go viral. She couldn't. She'd lived the reality of that 12-second clip for 20 years. She didn't need to see it memorialized on millions of screens to know what it meant. She spent Friday morning at her mother's apartment in Queens, the first time she'd crossed that threshold in almost 3 years. Her mother opened the door, took one look at Kendra's face, the bruise blooming purple across her cheek, and pulled her daughter into her arms without a single word. No "I told you so." No recriminations. Just the kind of love Kendra had forgotten existed. "I'm sorry, Mama," Kendra whispered into her mother's shoulder. "You were right. About everything." "Hush now. You're here. That's what matters. You're here and you're safe, and we're going to figure this out together." The messages started arriving around noon. Hundreds of them. Friends she hadn't spoken to in years, reaching out with shock and support and apologies for not pushing harder when they'd seen the warning signs. Domestic violence organizations offering resources. Lawyers offering pro bono representation. Strangers sending messages of solidarity and strength. And journalists. So many journalists. At first, Kendra ignored them all. The thought of speaking publicly, of making her private nightmare even more visible, felt impossible. But then a message came from a reporter at the Times, a woman named Diane Morrison who'd covered domestic violence cases for 15 years. "I know you're being bombarded," the message read. "I know this is overwhelming. But I also know that when powerful men are exposed, the narrative quickly becomes about them, their fall, their consequences, their redemption arc. Your voice matters. Your story matters. When you're ready, if you're ready, I'd like to help you tell it. On your terms." Kendra stared at those words for a long time. On your terms. When had anything in the last 20 years been on her terms? She called Diane that evening. The interview was scheduled for Sunday morning, 3 days after the video went viral. By then, the view count had exceeded 15 million. Jabari had withdrawn from the mayoral race in a terse statement that used the word regret, but never apologize. His campaign headquarters had closed. His political career was effectively over. But Kendra knew it couldn't end there. Not with just his statement. Not with just the video. Diane met her at a quiet studio in Manhattan. No audience. Just 2 women and a camera. Diane's first question was simple. Tell me about the Kendra that existed before Jabari. Something cracked open in Kendra's chest. For an hour, she talked about the woman she'd been, the social worker with fire in her belly, the advocate who'd believed she could change systems, the young woman who'd thought partnership meant elevation rather than erasure. She talked about the slow dismantling of her identity, the isolation disguised as importance, the corrections framed as care. "That video shows 12 seconds, Kendra said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. 12 seconds that people watch and think, that's the moment everything changed. But that wasn't the moment. That was just the first time anyone was watching. I lived 20 years of moments just like it. 20 years of being told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too ungrateful for questioning the man who'd given me such a good life. 20 years of learning that my voice only mattered when it was saying what he wanted to hear. Diane leaned forward. Some people are asking why you stayed, why you didn't leave sooner. Kendra's laugh was bitter. People always ask that. As if leaving were simple. As if I didn't try in small ways, every day for years. As if there's a clear moment when you realize you're in an abusive relationship, when the truth is that it happens so gradually you don't even recognize what you've lost until you're drowning in it. He didn't hit me regularly. He didn't lock me in rooms. He did something much more effective. He convinced me that I needed him. That without him, I was nothing. That my worth was contingent on my usefulness to his ambition. The interview aired Monday evening. Within an hour, it had been viewed 2 million times. Tuesday morning brought the second bombshell. Her name was Mireya Gonzalez. She'd worked on Jabari's congressional campaign 8 years ago, a young, brilliant strategist who'd been rising fast in Democratic circles. She called a press conference and stood in front of cameras with the same kind of exhausted courage Kendra recognized in her own mirror. "I had an affair with Jabari Hutchinson," Mireya said, her voice shaking but clear. "It lasted 6 months. And when I tried to end it, when I told him I couldn't keep lying to his wife, to the team, to myself, he hit me. Just once. Hard enough to knock me to the ground. Hard enough to fracture my cheekbone." The cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. "I reported it to his campaign manager," Simone continued. "And within a week, I was fired. Not officially for reporting the abuse. They were too smart for that. They cited performance issues and culture fit. Jabari called me personally to tell me that if I ever spoke about what happened, he'd destroy my career. He had connections, money, power. I had a fractured cheek and a ruined reputation. So I stayed quiet. For 8 years, I stayed quiet while he climbed higher and higher, promising dignity to a city while threatening the women who knew the truth about him." She pulled out a folder. "I kept everything. Medical records from the ER visit. Emails from the campaign manager. Text messages from Jabari. All of it. I'm filing a lawsuit today. And I'm telling my story because Kendra Hutchinson shouldn't have to carry this alone." The story exploded again. The narrative shifted. This wasn't just one incident in a diner. This was a pattern. A history. A man who'd spent decades wielding his power as a weapon while speaking publicly about justice and dignity and protecting the vulnerable. By Wednesday, 3 more women had come forward. Staffers, volunteers, people who'd witnessed his temper, experienced his control, survived his manipulation. The man who'd promised to restore dignity to New York City was being systematically exposed as someone who'd never understood what the word meant. Jabari's lawyer issued a statement denying all allegations. But the statements rang hollow against the mounting evidence, the documented pattern, the chorus of women finally speaking their truth. Kendra watched it unfold from her mother's apartment, feeling something she hadn't felt in 20 years, vindication. Not satisfaction, there was too much pain for that. But the deep, bone-level relief of knowing she wasn't crazy. Wasn't dramatic. Wasn't alone. The truth was coming out. And it was bigger than 12 seconds of video. It was 2 decades of systematic abuse, finally visible, finally undeniable, finally heard. 6 months later, Kendra stood in front of a community center in Brooklyn, addressing a room full of domestic violence survivors. She'd been asked to speak at dozens of events since the video, but this was the first one she'd accepted. She wasn't ready to be a symbol or a spokesperson. She was still figuring out who Kendra was without Jabari's narrative defining her. But she was ready to tell the truth. "I want to start by saying something that might sound strange," she began, her voice calm and clear. "I'm grateful for that video. Not because I wanted the world to see that moment of violence. Not because I wanted my trauma to become entertainment for millions of people. but because it finally gave me permission to stop pretending. To stop protecting someone who'd spent 20 years convincing me that his image was more important than my reality. She looked out at the faces in the audience, women and men of all ages, all backgrounds, all carrying their own stories of survival. The divorce was finalized last month. I took back my maiden name. I'm Kendra Hayes again, a name I haven't used in 20 years, but one that feels like coming home. Jabari is facing criminal charges for assault. His political career is over. The man who promised dignity to this city will never hold public office again. There was a moment of silence. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then the whole room erupted in applause. Kendra held up her hand, tears streaming down her face. But here's what I want you to understand. That's not the victory. His fall isn't what freed me. Speaking my truth is what freed me. Stopping the performance is what freed me. Refusing to protect his image at the cost of my own humanity is what freed me. She took a breath, centered herself. I've started painting again. It's been 15 years since I held a brush, but it turns out your passion doesn't die just because someone tried to kill it. It waits. It survives. Just like we do. I'm also back in school, finishing my master's in social work. Because that woman who believed she could change systems? She's still here. She was just buried under 20 years of someone else's ambition. More applause. More tears. Kendra saw her mother in the back row, beaming with pride. If you're in a situation like I was, if you're reading the storms, if you're learning to make yourself smaller, if you're being told that your truth is less important than someone else's image, please hear me. You deserve more. You deserve safety. You deserve to take up space. You deserve to be loved without conditions or control. She paused, gathering her final thoughts. The truth will set you free, but first it might go viral. And that's okay. Your truth is more important than anyone's image. More important than their career. More important than keeping peace or maintaining appearances or protecting people who've never protected you. Speak it. Live it. Reclaim it. You're worth fighting for. The applause was deafening. Kendra stepped down from the podium and was immediately surrounded by survivors wanting to share their stories, to say thank you, to tell her they'd been inspired to leave, to speak up, to stop protecting their abusers. Later that night, sitting in her small apartment, not a showroom, not a stage, but a real home that belonged only to her, Kendra opened her laptop and began to write. Not for a campaign. Not for someone else's narrative. For herself. The words flowed like water. If Kendra's story moved you, if you believe that abusers hiding behind power and status need to be exposed, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because people like Jabari count on our silence. They count on us looking away, staying quiet, protecting their carefully constructed images while they destroy lives behind closed doors. Don't be complicit in that silence. Subscribe if you stand against abuse in all its forms, be it emotional, physical, or even financial. Subscribe if you believe survivors deserve to be heard and believed. Subscribe if you refuse to let powerful people hide their cruelty behind charm and political promises. And if you believe that speaking the truth matters more than protecting someone's reputation, comment, "I stand with survivors" right now. Because every comment, every subscription, every share tells other survivors they're not alone. It tells people like Jabari that their power has limits. It tells the world that we're paying attention. Don't side with the abusers. Don't side with the people who value image over humanity. Stand with Kendra. Stand with Mireya. Stand with every person who's found the courage to stop performing and start living their truth. Subscribe, comment, and share. Because silence protects abusers, but your voice, your engagement, can help save lives.